among the deadliest female serial killers in history, few inspire as much horror as Dorothea Puente, the grandmotherly figure who turned her Sacramento boarding house into a house of death. With her soft-spoken voice, tidy dresses, and kindly demeanor, she seemed like a harmless old woman, but behind the lace curtains and the polite smile, Puente was hiding bodies in her backyard, all while cashing in on the government benefits of her victims. Born in Redlands, California in 1929, Dorothea's childhood was marked by hardship and trauma. Both of her parents were abusive, and she was orphaned at an early age. As she grew older, she sought stability through relationships, but marriages failed one after another. By the 1960s, she had already built a criminal record for check fraud and running brothels. Still, to those who met her later in life, Dorothea came across as a sweet, grandmotherly woman who offered housing to society's forgotten, the elderly, the mentally ill, and the disabled. She purchased a large Victorian home in Sacramento and converted it into a boarding house. It quickly gained a reputation as a safe haven for people with nowhere else to go. Residents were given meals, a clean bed, and the assurance that someone was looking after them. Social workers saw her as an asset to the community, someone willing to take in difficult cases that others refused. But beneath that image, Dorothea had crafted a scheme that would turn her house into a killing ground. Her method was as ruthless as it was simple. She would welcome vulnerable tenants into her home, many of them receiving Social Security or disability checks. Once they were settled in, she would ensure she became the payee for their benefits, controlling their income. For some residents, that was all she needed. She pocketed the money while offering the bare minimum of care. But for others, the scheme went further. When a tenant began to demand too much, when they threatened to leave, or when Dorothea simply decided they were worth more dead than alive, she poisoned them with overdoses of sleeping pills. After the victims died, she didn't call authorities. Instead, she quietly buried them in the backyard of her home, planting flowers and shrubs above the graves to disguise the disturbed earth. Over time, her garden became a cemetery with layer after layer of shallow graves concealing the bodies of her tenants. Suspicion began to mount in the mid-1980s. A social worker was investigating the disappearance of one of her clients, a man named Alberto Montoya, a developmentally disabled individual with schizophrenia. He had last been seen at Dorothea's boarding house. When the social worker pressed Dorothea for answers, she gave vague explanations, insisting he had left on his own. But the worker was not convinced and alerted police. When detectives arrived at Puente's home, they found an elderly woman who seemed cooperative and even grandmotherly. She allowed them to search the property. At first, nothing seemed amiss, until they dug in the backyard. What they uncovered shocked even seasoned investigators. Buried beneath the soil were human remains, and the more they dug, the more bodies they found. In total, 7 corpses were unearthed from her backyard. Later investigations linked her to at least 9 confirmed murders. though some suspect the number may have been higher. Most victims were vulnerable adults who trusted her to care for them. Instead, she treated them as disposable, their lives reduced to government checks and burial plots beneath her rose bushes. When confronted, Dorothea Puente maintained her innocence. She insisted she was being framed, that the tenants had died of natural causes and she had merely buried them out of kindness, afraid that reporting their deaths would cause her to lose her boarding license. But the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic testing revealed high levels of sedatives in the remains, and witness testimony painted a picture of a woman who manipulated, controlled, and ultimately murdered those under her care. Her trial in the early 1990s became a media spectacle. The contrast between her appearance, a frail, elderly woman with white hair and glasses, and the accusations against her fascinated the public. The defense leaned heavily on her grandmotherly image, portraying her as incapable of such atrocities. But the prosecution laid out the cold facts, the poisoned victims, the 4 checks, the buried corpses. In the end, the jury convicted her of multiple murders. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Even behind bars, Dorothea maintained her mask of innocence. She gave interviews insisting she had never harmed anyone. In prison, she became known for writing recipes and even contributed to a prison cookbook. But for the families of her victims, no amount of charm could erase the horror of what she had done. Dorothea Puente died in 2011 at the age of 82, still protesting her innocence. Yet the story she left behind is one of betrayal and manipulation, a chilling reminder that evil often hides in plain sight. Her house in Sacramento, with its garden of secrets, became infamous proof that sometimes the most ordinary-looking homes conceal unimaginable darkness. The case of Dorothea Puente lingers as one of the most disturbing in true crime history because of the deception at its core. She wasn't a shadowy figure lurking in alleys. She was someone people trusted, someone who looked like a grandmother offering kindness. But behind that mask, she treated human beings as nothing more than a source of income, erasing their lives and burying their bodies under flowers. Her victims were some of society's most vulnerable, and she turned their trust into a weapon. When people recall Japan's most shocking crimes, one name stands out with an almost mythical level of horror: Miyuki Ishikawa. To her neighbors in post-war Tokyo, she was a midwife, a caretaker, and a respected woman in her community. But to history, she is remembered as the demon midwife, responsible for the deaths of dozens, possibly hundreds, of infants, a crime spree that still horrifies Japan to this day. Miyuki was born in 1897, and by the time she reached adulthood, she had chosen a career in caregiving. Becoming a midwife was a respected profession, and it placed her in a role of deep trust. Families relied on her to help deliver their babies, to safeguard life at its most fragile moment. But beneath her professional appearance and social standing was a streak of cold calculation that would eventually turn her into one of the deadliest women in Japanese criminal history. The backdrop to her crimes was Japan in the 1940s and 1950s, a nation still reeling from the devastation of World War II. Poverty was rampant, families were struggling to survive, and the social safety net was fragile. In that context, Miyuki began to exploit the desperation of parents who could not afford to care for their children. The details of her scheme were horrifying in their simplicity. Parents would come to her overwhelmed by the burden of a new child they could not support. Instead of offering guidance or help, Miyuki began convincing them to let her handle the problem. Sometimes this meant urging them to abandon the child to her care. Other times it meant promising that she would find a way to ease their suffering. But what Miyuki truly offered was death. With the help of her husband, Takeshi Ishikawa, and at least one accomplice in the medical profession, she began deliberately neglecting and killing infants who were entrusted to her. In many cases, the children were allowed to starve. In others, more direct methods were used. For her, it was not simply about cruelty, though cruelty was certainly present. It was about profit. She charged parents fees for taking their children off their hands, then disposed of the infants' lives as if they were burdensome objects. The true number of victims will never be known. Officially, Miyuki Ishikawa was convicted of causing the deaths of more than 100 babies, but some investigators believe the actual toll was much higher, possibly over 200. At the time, her actions were rationalized by some as a grim reflection of Japan's poverty crisis. But there was nothing rational about the cold efficiency with which she carried out her crimes. The horrors came to light in 1948 when police discovered the decomposed remains of dozens of infants. The investigation quickly led back to Ishikawa and her husband. Shockwaves rippled through Tokyo. A trusted midwife, a figure meant to symbolize life and care, had been secretly orchestrating mass death. Her arrest and trial were a sensation. Many in the public were outraged not only by the crimes themselves, but by the way the justice system responded. Despite being linked to the deaths of more than 100 children, Miyuki Ishikawa received a shockingly lenient sentence, just 4 years in prison. Her husband was given an even lighter punishment. The courts argued that the parents bore responsibility for abandoning their children and that Ishikawa's role, while criminal, was not entirely her own doing. For the families of the lost children and for much of the Japanese public, the sentence was a second outrage. How could someone responsible for such a staggering loss of life walk free after only a handful of years? The leniency sparked debates about poverty, responsibility, and the value of life in post-war Japan. It also revealed how easily society could excuse monstrous acts when they were hidden behind the mask of necessity. Miyuki Ishikawa faded from public life after serving her sentence, and little is known of her later years. But the shadow of her crimes remains. She is remembered not only for the sheer scale of her killing, but for the betrayal of trust at the heart of her actions. As a midwife, she was supposed to welcome life, to protect the most vulnerable. Instead, she turned her profession into a weapon of death, exploiting both the helplessness of children and the desperation of their parents. Her story remains one of the most haunting examples of how evil can wear the face of care. The image of a midwife holding newborn life in her hands should be one of hope. But in the case of Miyuki Ishikawa, it became a symbol of betrayal so vast that it shook an entire nation. In the quiet towns of Colombia during the 1990s, whispers began to spread of missing children, vanishing without a trace. Families mourned, communities searched, but the disappearances seemed endless and answers were scarce. It would take years before the horrifying truth emerged. Behind those disappearances was a woman named Fatima, better known as Leonarda Cianciulli, the soap maker of Correggio. But in Colombia, the name attached to these crimes belonged to someone else entirely, a woman who became known simply as La Bestia de los Niños, the beast of the children. Her real name was Magdalena Solis, and her crimes would mark her as one of the most sinister female killers in Latin American history. Magdalena's story began not with murder, but with manipulation. She and her brother, Eleazar, were drifters in Mexico. In the 1960s, they were drawn into a bizarre and destructive cult that preyed upon the vulnerable in the remote town of Yerba Buena. Posing as prophets, the Solis siblings convinced villagers that they were chosen representatives of the Aztec gods, demanding worship, obedience, and offerings. In that isolated community, cut off from the outside world, people believed them. What began as fraud soon devolved into ritualized abuse, violence, and ultimately murder. Magdalena herself took on the role of a goddess, cloaking herself in the trappings of divine authority. Villagers were forced to submit to her, to offer not only their possessions but their very lives. Under her rule, the cult carried out human sacrifices, with victims often chosen from among the villagers who refused to comply or who questioned her commands. The killings were brutal, and Magdalena seemed to revel in the bloodshed, reinforcing her control through terror. Her methods were cruel beyond comprehension. Victims were tortured before death, their suffering made into a spectacle for others to witness. Children were not spared. To Magdalena, human life became nothing more than a tool for maintaining power. She manipulated fear and faith with equal measure, creating a system where dissent meant death and obedience meant survival. The crimes of Magdalena Solis might have remained hidden longer, if not for the sheer scale of the violence. The number of disappearances and murders became too great to ignore. Eventually, authorities intervened, though by then much of the damage was done. When her cult was dismantled, the full extent of the atrocities shocked even seasoned investigators. Dozens of victims had been sacrificed in the name of her false divinity. Her arrest shattered the illusion of her godhood, but it did not erase the terror she had instilled. In court, she was portrayed as both a manipulator and a fanatic, someone who exploited the isolation and vulnerability of her followers. Witnesses describe scenes of ritual sacrifice that seem pulled from nightmares, blood spilled on altars, chants echoing through the night, the cries of victims drowned out by the demands of the cult. Magdalena Solis was convicted of multiple murders, though many believe the true number of her victims far exceeded those officially recorded. She was sentenced to decades in prison, where she lived out her days until her death. Unlike some killers who show remorse or attempt to justify their crimes, Magdalena remained steadfast in her belief that she had been chosen, that her actions were not crimes but divine acts. That unshakable conviction only deepened the horror of her legacy. Her story endures as a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation and the extremes of human cruelty. Unlike killers motivated purely by greed or jealousy, Magdalena weaponized belief itself. She turned faith into a weapon, twisting it to serve her hunger for power and control. The villagers of Yerba Buena believed they were serving a goddess. In reality, they were serving a murderer who cloaked her crimes in ritual and myth. Today, her name is less known outside of Mexico, but within the annals of true crime, Magdalena Solis stands as one of the most chilling female killers of the 20th century. Her reign of terror shows how ordinary human fears, fear of the unknown, fear of divine punishment, can be manipulated to justify the unthinkable. She was not merely a murderer. She was a self-made tyrant who demanded lives as tribute and who received them until the law finally intervened. The haunting question she leaves behind is one that transcends her specific crimes. How many others across history have cloaked evil in the guise of faith? And how many followers, desperate for meaning or salvation, have been willing to follow them into darkness? Among Europe's most haunting tales of female killers is the story of Leonarda Cianciulli, the woman who would become known as the soap maker of Correggio. Her crimes were so grotesque, so deeply unsettling, that they have remained etched into Italy's criminal history for decades. Beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary life, Leonarda hid obsessions with superstition, protection, and death, beliefs that would drive her to murder women she called friends and turn their bodies into soap and pastries. Leonarda was born in 1894 in Montella, a small town in southern Italy. From the beginning, her life was marked by hardship and superstition. Her mother reportedly cursed her while she was still in the womb, a dark shadow Leonarda carried with her throughout her life. She attempted suicide twice in her youth, and when she married a man her parents disapproved of, she was convinced that misfortune was her destiny. That belief became the cornerstone of her psyche. She believed her life was cursed, and the only way to fight fate was through magic and sacrifice. By the 1930s, Leonarda had settled in the town of Correggio with her husband. She became known as a fortune teller, someone who read palms and gave spiritual advice to women in her community. Outwardly, she was a kind maternal figure, but privately, she was tormented by the fear of losing her children. She had already endured multiple miscarriages and the deaths of several young children. Her surviving son, Giuseppe, became the center of her world. When World War II broke out, he was conscripted into the army, convinced that he would be killed unless she acted. Leonarda became obsessed with the idea that only human sacrifice could protect him from death. Her first victim was a woman named Faustina Setti, a lonely spinster who came to Leonarda seeking a husband. Leonarda promised to help arrange a match, but instructed Faustina to tell no one and to write farewell letters to her friends and family. Once Faustina was alone in Leonarda's home, Leonarda gave her drugged wine and killed her with an axe. She then dismembered the body, boiling the remains in cauldron, and, according to her later confession, she used the fat to make soap and bake the blood into tea cakes, which she served to neighbors and family. Her second victim was Francesca Suavi, a schoolteacher who sought work. Leonarda convinced her that she had arranged a teaching job in another town. Following the same method, she lured Francesca into her home, killed her, and disposed of her body in the same gruesome way. Again, she made soap and pastries from the remains, distributing them to unsuspecting neighbors who remarked on how sweet and good they tasted. The third victim was Virginia Cacioppo, a former opera singer who had fallen on hard times. Leonarda promised her work as a secretary for a wealthy man. When Virginia entered her home, Leonarda repeated her ritual: drugged wine, an axe, dismemberment, boiling, but Virginia's disappearance drew more attention than the others. She was more prominent, and her sudden vanishing was noticed by many. The police began to investigate, and suspicion quickly fell on Leonarda. She was arrested in 1940, and during interrogation, she confessed without hesitation. In fact, she seemed almost proud of her work, describing her recipes and methods in chilling detail. Her matter-of-fact tone disturbed even the most hardened officers. Her trial became one of the most sensational in Italy's history. Newspapers seized on the gruesome details, dubbing her the soap maker of Correggio Tatemao. In court, she explained her motive as maternal devotion. She had sacrificed these women to save her son from death in the war. In her twisted logic, the blood of her victims had been an offering to fate, ensuring Giuseppe's safety. Leonarda was convicted of 3 murders and sentenced to 30 years in prison and 3 years in a criminal asylum. She served her time quietly, reportedly showing little remorse. In 1970, she died in prison at the age of 76. The legacy of Leonarda Cianciulli is as grotesque as it is unforgettable. She did not kill for greed or jealousy, but out of a delusional belief in magic and sacrifice. Her victims were women who trusted her, who sought her guidance, and who were betrayed in the most horrifying way imaginable. The idea of turning human remains into soap and pastries became a symbol of her depravity, an image that has haunted Italian culture for decades. What makes her story particularly chilling is how ordinary she seemed. She was a fortune teller, a neighbor, a mother devoted to her son. But under that surface, she was a killer who believed that spilling blood and boiling flesh could somehow appease destiny. Her crimes remain a testament to the extremes of superstition and the darkness that can grow when fear twists into obsession. In Russia, at the turn of the 20th century, a woman named Daria Nikolaevna Saltykova, better known as Saltychika, became a symbol of cruelty so extreme that her name is still remembered with disgust centuries later. While many female killers preyed on lovers, children, or strangers, Daria targeted those who were utterly defenseless, her own household serfs. To history, she is remembered as one of the most sadistic noblewomen in Russian history, a woman whose reign of terror claimed the lives of more than 100 victims. Daria was born into privilege in 1730, a member of the Russian nobility. She inherited vast estates and wealth after marrying into another aristocratic family. To outsiders, she embodied the life of a noble woman, refined, wealthy, and pious, often donating to churches and maintaining a reputation of outward religiosity. But inside the walls of her estate, she was feared. Her cruelty, especially toward young female serfs, became legendary, and her victims were often teenage girls and young women who served her household. Daria subjected them to unimaginable abuse, beating them with whips, sticks, and even red-hot pokers. Witnesses later testified that she poured boiling water over servants, mutilated them, and left their broken bodies in the fields as examples to others. Her rage was said to flare at the smallest provocations: a dress not ironed properly, a piece of laundry misplaced, or even a look she deemed disrespectful. For years, her violence went unchecked. In 18th century Russia, serfs were considered property, with few rights and little recourse against their masters. Complaints often fell on deaf ears, and Daria's noble status gave her protection. Families of the murdered and abused begged for justice, but local authorities turned a blind eye, unwilling to challenge someone of her social standing. But as the number of deaths rose, the whispers became too loud to ignore. Reports suggest that she killed more than 100 serfs, though official investigations confirmed 75 deaths and the brutal abuse of many more. The sheer scale of her crimes forced the matter to higher authorities. The case eventually reached Empress Catherine the Great, who ordered a full investigation. It was a rare moment in which the cries of peasants were heard by the throne. Investigators interviewed dozens of witnesses, compiling harrowing testimony of Daria's sadism. They learned of young women beaten to death, others starved, still others tortured for hours before succumbing. When she was finally arrested in 1762, the Russian public was riveted. The nobility was rarely held accountable for abuses, let alone mass murder. Her trial revealed the depth of her cruelty, and for once her wealth and position could not protect her. Daria Saltykova was convicted of the torture and murder of 38 serfs, though the true toll was far higher. Her sentence was not execution, as many expected, but a punishment crafted to strip her of honor. She was paraded publicly in Moscow, chained and displayed with a sign labeling her torturer and murderer. Crowds gathered to see the once proud noblewoman humiliated before being taken away. Her final sentence was life imprisonment in a convent prison. She was confined to a windowless underground cell where she remained for 33 years. Guards reported that she lived in isolation, consumed by madness until her death in 1801 at the age of 71. The story of Daria Saltykova is one of unchecked power and cruelty. Unlike other serial killers who operated in secrecy, her murders were committed in the open, with witnesses forced to watch but powerless to act. She killed not out of necessity or even calculated gain, but seemingly for the satisfaction of exerting dominance and inflicting pain. Her case sent a chilling message across Russia. Even In a society where serfs were often treated brutally, her violence was considered excessive, inhuman. She became a symbol of aristocratic corruption and cruelty, a warning of what happens when absolute power is left unchecked. Today, she is remembered not only as a murderer, but as a historical figure whose crimes stand as some of the worst abuses of the feudal system. Her name, Saltychika, remains synonymous with sadism in Russian culture. While centuries have passed, the haunting image endures: a noblewoman draped in wealth and piety, hiding the soul of a killer who found pleasure in the suffering of those least able to defend themselves. In Hungary, during the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the legend of Countess Elizabeth Báthory took root, a tale of a woman so consumed by cruelty and obsession that she has been remembered for centuries as one of the most prolific female killers in history. Known as the Blood Countess, she stands among the most infamous noblewomen ever to live, accused of torturing and killing hundreds of young girls. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Europe. The Báthory name carried influence, wealth, and ties to royalty, and from a young age, she was groomed for privilege. Married to Count Ferenc Nadasdy, a distinguished soldier, she ruled vast estates while her husband fought in wars. Elizabeth was educated, fluent in multiple languages, and outwardly presented herself as the perfect noblewoman of her era. But beneath the polished image, a darkness grew. When her husband died in 1604, Elizabeth found herself managing her estates alone. That was when the rumors began: servants disappearing, young girls vanishing after being summoned to the castle, strange cries echoing through the night. Testimonies later painted a horrific picture. Elizabeth, it was said, lured peasant girls to her castle under the promise of work or noble service. Once inside, they were subjected to savage torture, beaten with clubs, burned with hot irons, cut with scissors, and left to freeze in the snow. Some accounts claim she bit chunks of flesh from her victims, others that she bathed in their blood, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. While historians debate whether the blood-bathing legend was exaggeration, there is no doubt that Elizabeth's reign of cruelty left hundreds dead. Her accomplices, several loyal servants, helped procure victims and carry out the punishments. For years, her crimes were hidden by her immense power. The peasant class was expendable, and few dared to challenge someone of her stature. But as the body count rose, whispers reached the ears of the nobility and church officials. Parents of missing daughters demanded answers, and soon even the Hungarian king could not ignore the scandal. In 1610, an investigation was ordered. Authorities raided Szegety Castle and discovered horrifying evidence. Dozens of mutilated bodies were found buried around the grounds, with survivors testifying to unspeakable acts of torture. Witnesses spoke of rooms stained with blood and chambers designed for suffering. Elizabeth's trial in 1611 became one of the most sensational of its time. Her accomplices were convicted and executed, burned alive, or tortured before death. But Elizabeth herself, due to her noble blood, was spared execution. Instead, she was condemned to a fate that some considered worse. She was bricked into a set of rooms in her castle, with only small slits through which food and air could pass. For 4 years, she lived entombed in her own fortress until her death in 1614. The exact number of her victims remains debated. Official records list around 80 confirmed deaths, but other estimates suggest the true toll may have exceeded 600. Whether or not the figure is exaggerated, Elizabeth Báthory has become a symbol of unchecked cruelty, her name synonymous with sadism. Her story leaves a chilling legacy. Was she truly a bloodthirsty killer, obsessed with eternal youth, or a powerful woman scapegoated by rivals who wanted her vast estates? Historians still argue, but the testimonies of survivors, the bodies found, and the sheer consistency of the accusations leave little doubt that countless girls suffered and died under her rule. For centuries, the legend of the Blood Countess has inspired folklore, novels, and even modern horror films, but beyond the myth lies the undeniable truth. Elizabeth Báthory, noblewoman of Hungary, used her position of power to prey on the vulnerable, leaving behind a legacy of cruelty that has not been forgotten. She stands as a haunting final chapter in the story of history's most evil female killers. From jealousy and greed to sadism and lust for power, these women shattered every expectation of femininity, proving that evil knows no gender. Their crimes remind us of the fragile boundary between privilege and justice, between trust and betrayal, and between life and the abyss. In the quiet streets of Mexico City during the early 2000s, fear began to spread among the elderly. A series of murders baffled police. Older women, many living alone, were being found strangled inside their homes. The killer left little evidence behind, only the marks of brutal force and the sense of an intruder who had gained their trust. For months, authorities chased shadows, unable to pin down a suspect. The truth, when it emerged, stunned the nation. The killer was not a man, as many had assumed, but a woman known as Juana Barraza, a former professional wrestler who would become infamous as La Mata Viejitas. The little old lady killer, born in 1957 in rural Mexico, Juana's life was marked from the start by trauma and instability. Her father abandoned the family when she was a child, and her mother was abusive, often neglecting her daughter's needs. The most devastating betrayal came when her mother reportedly traded her to a man in exchange for a few beers. Juana, just a girl, was subjected to years of sexual abuse, an experience that left deep scars of anger and resentment. She grew up hardened, with little education, finding solace only in sports and the world of lucha libre, professional wrestling. In the 1980s and 1990s, she wrestled under the name La Dama del Silencio, the Lady of Silence. In the ring, she donned a mask, performed for crowds, and lived in the fleeting spotlight of Mexico's wrestling culture. But outside the arena, she lived in poverty, a single mother raising children. She struggled to support her family, taking on odd jobs to survive. That combination of poverty, anger at her abusive past, and bitterness toward the elderly women she associated with her mother laid the foundation for her future crimes. The killings began quietly. Elderly women were found dead in their apartments, often strangled with cords, scarves, or even stethoscopes. At first, investigators assumed the killer must be a man, perhaps a burglar targeting vulnerable victims. Police even released sketches based on eyewitness accounts that suggested a tall, muscular man disguised as a woman. For years, this assumption blinded them to the real suspect, who was hiding in plain sight. Juana's method was chillingly effective. She would dress as a social worker or wear clothing that gave her the appearance of an official figure, gaining entry into homes by offering government assistance or health checks. She exploited the natural trust of elderly women. Once inside, she attacked with brute force, overpowering her victims with strength honed from years in the wrestling ring. Many were strangled, some beaten, and often nothing more than a few valuables were taken, making the crimes appear at first like robberies gone wrong. By the mid-2000s, the pattern was undeniable. More than a dozen elderly women had been killed in similar circumstances. Panic spread across Mexico City. Newspapers screamed headlines about La Mata Viejitas, and elderly residents began to fear opening their doors to strangers. Families urged their mothers and grandmothers not to trust anyone, even those claiming to be social workers. The investigation became one of the largest in Mexico's history, but mistakes plagued the effort. Authorities arrested and released suspects, at one point even detaining trans women and homeless men under suspicion, a move that drew criticism and accusations of scapegoating. Meanwhile, Juana continued her spree, her confidence growing with each murder. It was not until January 2006 that fate intervened. Police responding to a report of a murder spotted a woman leaving the scene. She matched eyewitness descriptions, and when they apprehended her, they found documents and possessions linking her to multiple crime scenes. Her arrest shocked the public, not just because the killer was finally caught, but because she was a woman, and a wrestler no less. The image of the masked luchadora who once entertained crowds was forever replaced by that of a cold-blooded killer. During interrogation, Juana confessed to several murders, though she denied others attributed to her. Investigators believed she may have been responsible for as many as 40 victims, though she was ultimately convicted of 16. Her trial in 2008 was a media sensation. Prosecutors painted her as a ruthless predator who targeted the most vulnerable members of society, women who had lived long lives, only to have them cut short by betrayal in their final moments. The defense argued her traumatic past, her abuse, and her poverty played roles in shaping her crimes. But the jury had little sympathy. Juana Barraza was sentenced to 759 years in prison, effectively ensuring she would die behind bars. Even in prison, Juana remained a figure of morbid fascination. Some inmates admired her strength, while others feared her. Journalists flocked to her story, dissecting the psychological roots of her violence. Criminologists pointed to her hatred of her mother as a central motive. Her victims became surrogates for the woman who had abandoned and betrayed her. Her case also exposed deep flaws in Mexico's policing, from gender biases to systemic corruption that allowed her to operate for so long. For the families of her victims, the wounds remain open. Elderly women who survived her attempts spoke of the terror of realizing that someone they had welcomed into their homes, believing she came to help, had instead come to kill. The betrayal cut deeper than the violence itself. The story of Juana Barraza lingers as one of the most unsettling reminders of how appearances deceive. A wrestler, a mother, a seemingly ordinary woman, she became a predator whose weapon was trust, whose victims were the vulnerable, and whose legacy will forever haunt Mexico. When people in Romania spoke of kindness, charity, and hospitality, They once pointed to the aristocratic household of Countess Vera Renzi. She was beautiful, charming, and devoted, or so it seemed. But beneath her graceful exterior was an obsessive possessiveness so extreme that it would turn to murder again and again. By the time her story was fully told, Vera would be remembered as one of Europe's most prolific female killers, a woman who poisoned dozens of men, including her own lovers, husbands, and even her child. Vera Renzi was born around 1903 in Bucharest, Romania, to a wealthy family. From her early teenage years, she was described as headstrong, restless, and insatiably jealous. Those who knew her said she was incapable of tolerating neglect. If she loved someone, she demanded their constant attention. If they strayed or even seemed distracted, she burned with suspicion. Her beauty attracted many suitors, and by the time she was 15, she was already engaged in relationships with older men. That hunger for affection, paired with her inability to endure betrayal, would define the course of her life. She married young. Her first husband, reportedly a wealthy businessman. At first, their marriage seemed like a fairy tale, but within a year, he disappeared. Vera explained to acquaintances that he had abandoned her, running off with another woman. Few questioned her story. Not long after, she remarried, this time to a man of similar wealth and standing. Again, tragedy struck. Her second husband also vanished, leaving Vera alone once more. Friends and neighbors pitied her, believing she was cursed by fate to lose those closest to her. But whispers grew louder with each disappearance. The truth was far darker than anyone suspected. Vera had been poisoning her husbands with arsenic, slipping it into their food and drink. Unlike crimes of passion committed in the heat of the moment, hers were calculated, deliberate, and rooted in her obsession with control. If a man she loved paid attention to another woman, if he came home late, if he failed to meet her standards of devotion, she viewed it as betrayal. And betrayal in Vera's world was punishable by death. After her husbands, she moved on to lovers. She had many, some fleeting, others longer affairs, but nearly all ended the same way. As soon as she grew jealous or feared abandonment, she lured them into her home, fed them poisoned wine, and watched as they collapsed. Then she disposed of their bodies in the most chilling way imaginable. She placed them in zinc-lined coffins which she kept locked in the cellar beneath her mansion. To Vera, it wasn't enough to kill. She wanted to keep them near her, imprisoned even in death, as if to ensure they would never leave her side. The macabre collection of coffins grew over time, stacked one after another in the darkness. Each contained the remains of a man who had once promised her love. At one point, even her own son is said to have fallen victim to her jealousy. Some accounts suggest that when he discovered the secret of her cellar and threatened to expose her, she poisoned him as well, sealing him away with the others. Her undoing came not through sudden revelation, but through persistence. One lover vanished after visiting her, and his family demanded answers. Police searched her home and in the cellar made the gruesome discovery: dozens of coffins, each with a body inside. The sight horrified investigators, and the press soon branded her a monster in human form. Reports at the time claimed as many as 35 men were found, all poisoned by her hand. In court, Vera confessed with chilling calm. She admitted to poisoning her husbands, her lovers, and possibly her child. She explained her motives in cold, matter-of-fact terms. She could not stand the thought of them betraying her, of them loving another. If she couldn't have their undivided devotion, then they would not live at all. To her, murder was simply the means of preserving loyalty forever. She was sentenced to life imprisonment, spending the remainder of her days in a women's prison in Romania. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments